My mother was my first call in a crisis. The last call she made was to me. That bond took 53 years to build. She taught me true loyalty. That made it terrifying to finally realize the truth. I had spent 7 years building a real estate empire for people who viewed me merely as a utility. The morning I signed my divorce papers was the absolute last time my ex-wife's family would treat me like property they owned. Have you ever realized the people you called family only saw you as something to be used? How did you find the strength to walk away? The boardroom smelled of polished mahogany and false civility. I sat across from my soon-to-be ex-wife, Clara, and her parents, Gregory and Barbara. We were finalizing a divorce, but they treated the mediation exactly like a corporate termination. There was no grief in the room, just the cold efficiency of wealthy people discarding an asset that had stopped generating the required aesthetic returns. They didn't even bother to hide their excitement about my replacement. Gregory leaned back in his leather chair, openly praising Derek Clara's new tech investor partner right in front of me. He talked about Derek's vision for the family's future, his tone dripping with the implication that I'd always lacked the drive for their level of wealth. I remained perfectly silent, reviewing the final separation agreement. I was accepting a $450,000 buyout for my share of the primary limited liability company. It was a remarkably modest sum considering I was the lead architect who had designed the crown jewel of their real estate portfolio. Gregory slid the paper toward me with a slight smirk, clearly believing he had just negotiated the steal of the century. Beside him, Clara absent-mindedly rubbed her stomach. She let out a heavy sigh, complaining to the mediator about the severe stress she had been under lately. She explicitly blamed it on the lingering fatigue from a solo wellness retreat she took in Sedona last fall. I kept my eyes on the pen in my hand, but internally, the timeline locked into place. I knew exactly what dates she was talking about. I didn't say a word. Looking back now, people often ask me how I stayed so calm in that room. Why didn't I throw the pen? Why didn't I scream at them for the blatant disrespect? If I'm being honest, it was because I finally understood my role in their lives. Anger is an emotional negotiation. It is a desperate demand for respect from someone you believe is capable of giving it. But you cannot demand respect from people who view you as an appliance. They never saw me as a husband or a son-in-law. I was a load-bearing pillar in their financial structure, a utility provider. You don't yell at people who use you like a machine. You don't try to make them understand your pain. You simply unplug yourself from their wall. I signed my name on the dotted line, trading 7 years of my life for a fraction of what I built. They thought they were buying my silence for pennies. They didn't realize I was paying them to take the liability. My architectural studio felt remarkably empty. The sound of packing tape echoed loudly against the bare walls. I was quietly boxing up the physical remnants of the last 7 years. Across the city, Clara was likely posting loud, carefully curated photos of her new life with Derek, eagerly selling the illusion of a seamless and perfect transition to her followers. That contrast didn't bother me in the slightest. My attention was entirely focused on the heavy rolls of drafting paper resting on my desk. These were the foundational designs for the crown jewel of her family's real estate portfolio, a massive commercial development currently carrying $3,800,000 in leveraged debt. I designed that building from the ground up. Over the years, I sacrificed my weekends, deliberately delayed the growth of my own independent firm, and poured my mental health into a project that Gregory proudly paraded to his investors as his own personal vision. He loved the applause and the prestige. I simply did the math and ensured the roof would hold. But when it finally came time to leave, taking my life's work back required a level of cold discipline I didn't know I possessed. People often think walking away from a toxic family dynamic is a single cinematic moment. A slammed door, a thrown glass, or a sharp final sentence. At the time, I didn't realize that a true permanent escape is nothing like that at all. Real escapes are built in absolute silence, paragraph by paragraph, buried inside dense legal documents. Untangling my intellectual property from their corporate structure was a grueling, terrifying 6-month process. It wasn't about revenge, it was about basic survival. I spent my evenings sitting in the sterile, fluorescent-lit offices of a specialized patent attorney, paying exorbitant hourly rates just to navigate complex trust laws. We had to carefully sever my core computer-aided designs and my personal architectural stamps from the family's primary company. The objective was to legally remove my assets without triggering a premature audit. It was agonizing, deeply unglamorous work. Every time Gregory casually asked for a routine project update, my stomach would drop, fearing he had finally looked too closely at the internal server permissions. I almost got caught twice by his lead accountant when we were adjusting the internal licensing agreements. I sacrificed my sleep and my peace of mind to ensure every single transfer was completely ironclad. The family assumed the company name and the social prestige were the only things of actual value. They were so obsessed with the aesthetic of wealth that they completely ignored the mechanics of it. They never bothered to verify who actually owned the legal rights to the structural foundation. Now, the physical blueprints were packed, the legal firewall was constructed, but I wasn't entirely free just yet. Until the bank officially cleared my exit funds, I was still standing inside a burning building. The ink on the binding settlement agreement was barely dry. The aggressive demands started almost immediately. I hadn't even finished packing the last of my reference books when my phone lit up with a text message from Clara. It wasn't a question or a polite request. It was a direct order. She insisted that Derek needed the proprietary server passwords right away so he could present the commercial blueprints to a new round of prospective investors. I stared at the glowing screen, feeling the familiar heavy weight of their absolute entitlement. To them, I wasn't an ex-husband who just endured a painful separation. I was simply a stubborn vendor who was inexplicably delaying their grand financial vision. Before I could even process the audacity of the message, my phone vibrated again. This time, a voicemail from Gregory appeared. I listened to the audio in the quiet of my empty office. He spoke to me with the clipped, deeply irritated tone of a senior manager issuing an ultimatum to a subordinate. He explicitly threatened to call his attorneys and freeze my $450,000 buyout wire transfer if the complete architectural files were not handed over to his team by noon. My heart hammered against my ribs. I experienced a genuine, terrifying spike of panic. This was the exact friction point I had been dreading for months. If Gregory and Derek managed to bully their way into the project server before my exit funds officially cleared the banking system, they would immediately see that I had permanently revoked their access to my external cloud servers, leaving their internal shortcuts completely dead. The patents were legally secured under my personal trust, but the immediate optics of revoked access would give Gregory the excuse he needed to halt the bank wire. If that happened before the money was safe in my account, they could tie me up in frivolous litigation for years, draining my remaining resources just to punish me for leaving. The pressure in the room suddenly felt entirely suffocating. I was trapped in a high-stakes financial standoff. It took me years to understand the precise psychology behind that specific kind of anxiety. There is a terrifying liminal space between signing the exit papers and actually being free. You are legally separated, but practically you are still standing firmly within their blast radius. Toxic family systems always escalate their demands the exact moment they sense a subtle loss of control. They don't push harder because they are inherently strong. They push because they are aggressively testing the boundaries, desperate to see if your old buttons still work. They rely entirely on your conditioned fear to maintain their dominance and extract compliance. I looked down at the demanding text from Clara and listened to the end of Gregory's threatening voicemail. I didn't type out an angry, defensive reply. I didn't try to explain my position or justify my right to privacy. The time for negotiating with them had officially ended. I simply closed my phone, took a slow breath, and braced for the impact. When noon passed and I still hadn't replied to his threats or handed over the passwords, Gregory's reaction was instantaneous. Knowing he couldn't legally cancel a court-approved settlement wire just because I was ignoring him, he played dirty. He called the bank's fraud department and baselessly claimed my buyout was the result of corporate embezzlement, forcing the bank to trigger a mandatory administrative fraud hold. For 48 agonizing hours, my liquidity was completely paralyzed. I sat in my quiet, half-unpacked apartment, endlessly refreshing my banking portal. I was terrified that a single misplaced comma in my legal strategy or a minor oversight by my attorney had just cost me my entire financial future. The anxiety was a heavy physical weight in my chest. It wasn't a dramatic, cinematic confrontation. It was a silent, suffocating, bureaucratic terror. I had to trust the architecture of my own escape plan while standing entirely in the dark. But I had made a mistake. My attorney had built a flawless legal firewall. The banking compliance officers methodically reviewed the signed mediation agreements. They confirmed the lawful transfer of liability and quickly recognized Gregory's desperate financial hold for exactly what it was, a baseless intimidation tactic from a man rapidly losing control. On the morning of the third day, the screen refreshed and the $450,000 finally cleared into my private account. The funds were permanently secure, my patents were fully protected, the legal boundaries had finally taken effect. I was completely safe, but halfway across the city, their carefully constructed reality was about to violently collapse. Now that my exit funds were permanently secure, it was time to respond to his earlier demands. I didn't argue or defend my boundaries. I simply opened my laptop and drafted a succinct email to Gregory, ensuring I copied both of our legal teams to maintain a sterile, documented paper trail. I informed him that, per the exact stipulations of the newly signed settlement agreement, I had officially surrendered all of my rights to their primary limited liability company. Crucially, because I operated as an independent contractor, my foundational designs were never work for hire. I had only granted their company a temporary licensing agreement for patents I secured long before marrying Clara. With my exit finalized, that license was officially revoked. I explicitly stated that they were legally barred from utilizing my professional architectural stamp for their highly leveraged commercial development. Without my verified signature and my proprietary computer-aided design files, they could not pour a single yard of concrete or secure a single municipal permit. Their flagship project was legally dead in the water. I hit send, quietly severing the final tether between my intellect and their bank accounts. I didn't just email Gregory. I simultaneously filed a formal letter of withdrawal with the municipal building department, legally revoking my architect of record status for the site. If I'm being honest, I always knew their arrogance would be their ultimate undoing. Manipulative people who operate purely on entitlement share a remarkably predictable flaw. They obsess entirely over the paint, the curated social status, the luxury leased cars, the grand announcements to their wealthy peers. They are completely consumed by the outward facade. Because of that exact obsession, they never bother to inspect the plumbing. They never read the intricate contractual clauses regarding intellectual property, and they never respect the heavy, silent, structural labor required to keep their lifestyle standing. They simply assume the foundation will hold itself up because I'd always been there to carry the weight. The truth arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. I was quietly unpacking my drafting tools in my new apartment. The air was entirely still. There was no manufactured urgency, no passive-aggressive commentary regarding my choice of location, and no heavy expectations hanging in the room. My laptop chimed with a new email. It wasn't a legal threat. It was an automated notification from my health insurance provider. In her typical careless arrogance, Clara had forgotten to remove me as the primary policy holder. Attached was a routine explanation of benefits for her recent visit to an exclusive maternal fetal clinic. Is greater than I opened the digital document, which itemized a non-invasive prenatal test and explicitly stated the exact gestational age for billing purposes. I stood entirely still in my kitchen as the timeline locked perfectly into place. Conception had occurred exactly during the 2 weeks of Clara's heavily publicized solo wellness retreat in Sedona. The math was undeniable. That single routine laboratory report achieved two devastating things simultaneously. First, it definitively proved that the infidelity occurred well before our legal separation, proving that any earlier attempts to contest our prenuptial agreement were built on absolute fraud. Second, and far more destructively, it proved unequivocally that Derek was not the biological father. The flashy investor had been proudly financing and boasting about a legacy that belonged to an anonymous stranger. Society conditions us to expect the truth to be revealed in a dramatic confrontation, a screaming match where the wronged party finally gets to hurl their pain at the people who betrayed them. But real devastation is rarely cinematic. Sometimes, the absolute truth simply arrives on standard medical letterhead, read aloud by an underpaid clinician who has no idea they are quietly dismantling a lie that took years to construct. If I'm being honest, I didn't feel a sudden rush of triumphant vindication. I didn't laugh at the phone or celebrate their misery. I just felt a profound, heavy confirmation of the reality I had silently endured for the latter half of my marriage. The pristine social illusion they had worked so hard to maintain was completely shattering, and I didn't have to lift a single finger to break it. Derek truly believed he had stolen a grand prize from a lesser man. He didn't realize he had just signed up for someone else's consequence. The fallout was remarkably slow and entirely bureaucratic. There were no dramatic showdowns in the streets or tearful public apologies. Derek, realizing he was suddenly tethered to a public scandal and a child that belonged to someone else, handled the situation with the exact level of cowardice I expected. He didn't stay to fight or support Clara. He simply contacted his property management company, quietly broke the lease on his luxury apartment, and disappeared. He completely blocked her number, treating the end of their relationship like a bad venture capital investment. He was aggressively writing off. Meanwhile, the professional consequences of Gregory's arrogance began to compound at a crushing, methodical pace. Without my verified architectural stamp and the proprietary computer-aided design files, his project was legally illegitimate. Because of my formal letter of withdrawal, it didn't take long for the municipal city inspectors to arrive at the commercial job site. They reviewed the compromised paperwork, immediately voided the foundational building permits, and issued a formal stop work order. Construction was halted indefinitely. Gregory and Barbara were suddenly left holding a hollow, non-operational limited liability company. Even worse, they were fully responsible for $3,800,000 in active, high-interest commercial debt. The financial meter was running, and they had absolutely no engine to drive the project forward. Later that week, an email appeared in my inbox. It was from Gregory. Gone was the clipped, authoritative tone of a senior manager threatening a subordinate. Instead, the message was desperate and meandering, attempting to leverage a shared history that he had never actually respected. He practically begged me to return as an independent consultant, specifically invoking the phrase "for the good of the family." I sat at my desk and read the words on the screen. Looking back now, I expected to feel a surge of vindictive pleasure in that moment. Instead, I just felt a brief, quiet pang of pity for how incredibly small they had become. They had spent years treating my loyalty as an unlimited resource, completely blind to the reality that my compliance was the only thing shielding them from their own profound incompetence. I didn't reply to outline my grievances. I didn't send a list of demands or negotiate a higher consulting fee. I simply deleted the email and emptied the digital trash folder. It took me years to understand the true mechanics of walking away. The profound realization is that you do not have to destroy toxic people to find justice. You don't have to actively plot their ruin or orchestrate a grand revenge. If you simply draw a firm boundary, remove your support, and stop silently absorbing the consequences of their reckless actions, gravity will do the heavy lifting for you. They will eventually destroy themselves under the weight of their own compromised foundations. Their carefully curated world was rapidly caving in, but that was no longer my building. The cemetery was perfectly still that Friday morning. I stood before the simple granite headstone, marking my mother's resting place. The weather was remarkably calm. The air was cool and completely absent of the relentless manufactured noise I had lived inside for the past 7 years. I looked at the plain lettering of her name, reflecting on the stark difference between the loud, desperate facade of my former in-laws and the quiet integrity my mother had modeled for 53 years. She was not a complicated woman, but she understood that you can only ever build a lasting life on solid ground. At the time, I didn't fully comprehend the true cost of my departure. People hear a story about a man legally extracting his intellectual property and walking away with hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they immediately assume it is a triumphant cinematic victory. But I didn't win a lottery. I didn't emerge unscarred. I lost 7 years of my prime to people who never actually loved me. They loved my utility. They loved the structural weight I carried so they could comfortably focus on the aesthetics of their own lives. The $450,000 sitting safely in my account was never a trophy to be celebrated. It was simply a functional tool. It was the exact price required to buy back my own time and secure my peace. If I am being completely honest, there was a period when I desperately wanted them to realize my value. Society constantly conditions us to believe that we must actively fight for our worth. We are taught that when we are betrayed, discarded, or minimized, we have an obligation to stand our ground and forcefully prove to our abusers that we matter. We waste years agonizing over how to make manipulative people finally respect our contributions. It took me a long time to understand how deeply flawed that narrative truly is. The ultimate victory in life is never forcing a toxic person to recognize your worth. The true, lasting victory is finally realizing that their assessment of your value was always entirely irrelevant. Their inability to see your worth is their deficit, not your burden. You do not have to argue with people who are actively committed to misunderstanding you. You do not negotiate with a crumbling foundation. You simply pack up your tools, sever the connection, and walk away to build somewhere else. They are likely still out there right now, scrambling in the dark to keep their compromised roof from caving in. But that is the beautiful reality of walking away. Their collapse is no longer my emergency. I am finally building on solid ground. Have you ever had to walk away from a foundation you spent years building simply to protect your own peace? If this story resonated with your lived experience, I would truly appreciate hearing your perspective